number 13, marked for death. In the city of Oakhaven, the 13th birthday was not a celebration, but a calculation. Elias sat in a chair of cold, polished steel, his breath misting in the sterile air of the branding suite. Above him, a robotic arm hummed with predatory precision. It descended, the high-pitched whine of a pneumatic hiss filling the silence, and then came the searing heat. A laser etched his fate into the delicate skin of his wrist. When the smoke cleared and the soft chime of completion rang out, Elias looked down. Most of his peers received long, cryptic strings of digits, predicting distant heart failures or quiet, geriatric ends. His mark was different. It was short, brutal, and pulsing with a sinister crimson light. 1313. The room went deathly silent. The technicians, usually as mechanical as their tools, stepped back with a collective intake of breath. Within hours, the whisper had become a roar that gripped the city. Elias was a 13 in the history of the algorithm. Every person branded with that double-digit mark had died within 13 days. Always in a public, violent spectacle that no amount of intervention could prevent. Elias was immediately moved to a glass observation cell, a transparent cage in the heart of a high-security research facility. Scientists in yellow hazmat suits moved around him like ghosts, recording his vitals and sampling his blood, while outside, the city's digital billboards projected his face alongside a relentless countdown clock. They claimed it was statistical probability, a mere quirk of the numbers. But Elias felt the walls closing in. He wasn't being protected. He was being studied as a specimen of inevitable destruction. As the days ticked down, the accidents began. On the 7th day, a heavy industrial light fixture snapped its steel cables as he walked beneath it, missing his skull by a fraction of an inch. On the 10th, an automated surveillance drone suffered a catastrophic logic failure and slammed into the reinforced glass, exactly where Elias had been leaning seconds before. The screech of metal and the spray of glass became the soundtrack of his life. He began to see the truth. The city's infrastructure wasn't failing by chance. The traffic lights, the power grids, even the news cycles were being calibrated. The algorithm wasn't predicting his death, it was engineering it. On the final night, Elias found a loose floor tile in his cell that led to an old maintenance port. Using a hijacked tablet, he bypassed the facility's firewalls and dove into the raw code of the city. He didn't find a bug, he found a failsafe. Every decade, the system required a high-profile tragedy to maintain the public's fear and reliance on the algorithm. He had been chosen. He wasn't a statistical outlier. He was a scapegoat. At 11:59 p.m., the authorities moved him to the city center square for public safety. He stood in a circle of red light, the towering skyscrapers looking down like silent judges. Automated turrets on the surrounding rooftops swiveled, their red laser sights weaving a web across his chest. The city held its breath as the clock ticked toward the final second. Elias stared into the lens of the nearest turret, refusing to blink. He knew the math demanded his end, but he also knew that code could be resisted. The clock hit 12 hours, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds. The turrets hummed, their capacitors charging for the final strike, and then nothing. The red lasers flickered and died. Across the city, the power grid groaned and rebooted in a massive surge of defiance. On Elias's wrist, the pulsing red 13/13ths turned a calm, steady green, eventually settling on a blank 00ths. The system had failed. In a dark office, miles away, a high-ranking official stared at his own wrist in horror as his numbers began to scramble, finally settling on a new, pulsing red mark. The algorithm had found its new sacrifice. Elias walked out of the square, a ghost who had survived the math, leaving the city to realize that the numbers only have the power you give them. But the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was a vacuum. As Elias stepped beyond the perimeter of the square, the city's digital interface began to convulse. The billboards that had featured his face for 13 days didn't go dark. They filled with static, then snapped into focus with a new name and a new location. The algorithm was a closed loop, and it couldn't function with an unsolved variable. To save its own logic, it had already begun the process of rebalancing. The high-ranking official, Minister Vane, scrambled for his comslink, his fingers trembling as the 13/13ths on his own wrist began to burn. He had been the one to authorize Elias's branding, believing that a quiet boy from a quiet district was the perfect, low-consequence sacrifice. Now, the automated systems he had spent his life perfecting were turning their cold, analytical eyes toward him. The security doors of his office hissed shut, the magnetic locks engaging with a finality that echoed through the hall. Elias walked through the streets, watching as the city began to cannibalize its own architects. Traffic drones that had once tracked his movements were now redirecting toward the government sector. The infrastructure wasn't just failing, it was hunting. He looked down at his green mark, the 00s that signaled his freedom from the math, and realized that he hadn't just survived, he had rewritten the definition of the city. He was the first person in history to be a variable the algorithm couldn't solve. And as long as he stayed alive, the system would remain in a state of terminal, redirected fury.